Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy of love and her take on relationships was one of anti-commitment. I was surprised at how hard it was to find a movie that demonstrated a lot of the anti-commitment points she makes while also not being too grim. And I think it's because her take on marriage is just that. So de Beauvoir makes a pretty strong case against the institution of marriage and traditional committed relationships, and so does the film Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The film stars Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, who coincidentally got married after filming the movie and have since divorced. Outside of feminism, de Beauvoir is well known for her existentialist philosophy. She had a lot to say about freedom and its role within a meaningful life. De Beauvoir's existentialist philosophy argued, in part, that our lives are given meaning through the projects we undertake over the course of our lives. So for her, the extent that we're free directly impacts the projects we undertake. So restrictions in our freedom had a direct negative link to our ability to find meaning and fulfillment in our life through the projects we decide to take on. These restrictions in freedom either came through the internal psychological barriers we impose on ourselves or the external restrictions that were imposed on us through things like legal institutions and social expectations. For example, the law prevents you from starting a business in certain industries, and depending on your culture, you may have personally experienced barriers in pursuing certain hobbies, careers, or relationships. So, in the case of love and how it impacts our existential pursuit for meaning in life, de Beauvoir looked around her and noticed that love posed some different threats to our freedom, even when she looked at casual relationships. And when the institution of marriage was brought into the picture, the threats to our individual freedom grew and grew. Now, for her, this was true for both men and women. And honestly, a film that shows this all is Mr. and Mrs. Smith. It's a rom-com movie which follows two assassins and the ups and downs of their marriage. The film actually runs through a lot of the dangers that marriage poses to our lives as individuals, and unintentionally hits on the things that de Beauvoir warns us of. And more than anything, it gives us clues on how to stay happy while we're in a relationship. So let's get into the accidental genius of the film. And more than anything, let's dive deep into what de Beauvoir has to say about how to stay happy while being in a relationship. The reason why I love what de Beauvoir has to say is that it isn't just interesting, but more than anything, it's really, really useful. She gives us a whole lot of clues on ways to make relationships work in the long run, whether we opt for marriage or not. Okay, first let's look at a really important trade-off in the dynamics of a relationship, which was the battle between greed and generosity. So de Beauvoir thought there was an internal conflict within us that posed a threat to our freedom, and that was based in the attitude we take towards relationships. This internal struggle could be summarized as a battle between our own greed and our own generosity. This distinction is probably something that a lot of us are familiar with on both sides. When we're in love with someone, we have that feeling that we want to see the absolute best for them. Now, this generosity is contrasted by the feelings of possession we have for the people we romantically love. We have that possessive feeling either consciously or subconsciously that we want for them to be ours, at least in some sense. And this was part of the greed de Beauvoir spoke about. And this greed also manifests itself in some desires we have that either directly or indirectly control and restrict our partner. Unsurprisingly, for de Beauvoir, generosity was the ideal attitude we should have towards our relationship, and greed, as instinctively as it comes to us, was something we must actively fight against. And I'm speaking personally here, but being in a relationship myself, I think my wife and I both feel that we are each other's in some possessive sense. And what comes along with this is feelings of entitlement, like sometimes we unfairly expect favors from each other, even when it's more of an inconvenience to the other person than it would be of benefit to us. And in Mr. and Mrs. Smith, there's a really petty example of something like this.
Sweetheart, will you pass the salt?
It's in the middle of the table.
Was that the middle of the table?
Yeah, it's between you and me.
Now, going back to her existentialist philosophy, any restriction in our partner's freedoms restricted the projects they could take on and negatively impacts their ability to find meaning and fulfillment. going beyond petty things like passing the salt entitlement. Control and possessiveness can have bigger impacts on our relationships and lives. For example, it could be as simple as distracting our partners from pursuing their goals by asking too much time from them, or a failure to give support where it's needed. So, how do we overcome our greed and desire to control our partners? Well, in Simone de Beauvoir's fiction novel, Who Shall Die, one character summarizes that the only way to pursue this ideal of generous love was by joining the common fight. Her commentary here is this: to achieve a relationship where both partners are free and pursuing projects which give their lives meaning, we have to work for it. If you personally, right now, take a mental survey of all the friends and family you know who are in relationships, I think a lot of people would admit that at least the default mode of relationships is not one where both people are filling their lives with projects that make them happy. Now, in de Beauvoir's time, a lot of the control that was being imposed within a relationship was the male side being domineering over the female side. But I think there's a universal value in what she's saying, and I can personally think of relationships where there's control or greed in the way she talks about it coming from both sides of the fence. Simone herself highlights some different ways greed manifests on both sides of the traditional relationship, which we'll touch on later. But for now, a point to draw from the dynamic between greed and generosity in relationships is this: we have to fight our urge to control our partner, which she calls the renunciation of all possession. And more simply speaking, a takeaway would be this: we have to work on ourselves to ensure that if we are committed to someone, we are there to support them and not hold them back in the pursuit of their projects and life's work. Now, let's move on from the dynamic of greed and generosity. We'll revisit it later. When it comes to marriage, de Beauvoir gives a pretty solid case for why we should never get married. Three main drawbacks inherent in marriage are: it restricts freedom through its structure, it restricts freedom because it is by nature a commitment, and it is an anti-aphrodisiac. Now, I'll quickly work through these ideas, but just keep in mind that if we adopt a set of behaviors that falls on the side of generosity, and if we avoid the set of behaviors that fall on the side of greed, some of these drawbacks to being married can be seriously minimized, and that's just why we ran through it first. So, firstly, to generalize what was the case in her time, and still is the case in some instances today, marriage restricts freedom through its structure. Its structure is formed through law and also social expectations. So, in Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they both go from freely embarking on sexual escapades and traveling the world to being with one partner they've lost attraction to and stuck at home. But de Beauvoir gives an argument on how the structure and expectations surrounding marriage lead to this kind of domestication, which can for some people be extremely miserable. De Beauvoir's commentary on the social standing of marriage in her time was that for women, marriage was viewed as the most important thing for them to pursue. It was a social expectation that women should be putting all their efforts towards finding a partner to marry. What was important for women wasn't just the accomplishment of being married, but women came to be defined by who they married and the social standing of that person. Whether marriage was being done more traditionally for creating family alliances or their own romantic choice, the underlying structure of marriage was the same for de Beauvoir. The woman in the relationship was undermined in her freedom, even if given the freedom to pursue who they want. Her commentary was, once committed to marriage, the social arrangement was that the wife was supposed to be at the beck and call of her husband as a glorified sexual and housekeeping service. This social role is hardly one of freedom. Conversely, the social expectation was that in return for her service, a wife demanded guardianship and financial support from her husband. While for de Beauvoir, the husband's position was more free, she noted that in oppressing, one becomes oppressed. So, look at a more traditional marriage structure. The duties of the male spouse could be simplified as guardianship and financial support, while the female spouse's responsibilities consisted in sexual availability and housekeeping. So, in a way, each partner had the other in chains, where there is this underlying dynamic of, I'll do my part, but you better do yours. A relationship with this dynamic obviously inhibits freedom, so it was criticized by de Beauvoir. Now, the root of this problem goes back to the interplay between generosity and greed, which we discussed earlier. A relationship with these expectations and restrictive dynamic is being hindered by that type of greed, which could be understood as the desire to control our partners. So, a solution to this kind of situation just goes back to being more generous with how we treat our loved ones. By working on ourselves and reducing the extent that we want to control our partners, we can try to act as someone who supports them in achieving their projects rather than restricting that. So, going back to the structure of marriage, part of a solution to the problems created by marriage's structure may consist in not pushing the demand of complete sexual availability and housekeeping responsibilities on one spouse, and it may be best to not put all financial and guardianship responsibilities on the other. Rather than heaping different sets of responsibilities on each side, sharing the load can give freedom to both sides. This approach is fundamentally generous, and I would anecdotally say that more and more relationships are shifting towards this kind of structure today. As an obligatory side note, obviously I think some relationships that fall within this traditional structure happen that way freely. I just think when you factor in how much we're influenced by social expectations, de Beauvoir would argue that relationships that structure themselves in this way freely are few and far between. Okay, so on to another main drawback of marriage. Marriage restricts our freedom to the extent that it's a commitment. By nature, any commitment we make is a pledge on behalf of our future selves. So if I borrow money on the pledge or commitment that I will pay it back with interest by the end of the month, then come the end of the month, whatever I have left in my pocket isn't really mine to use freely until I've paid what's owed. So my financial freedom is restricted by the agreed dollar amount. Had I been free or without that commitment, I would have just spent the money on something else. So here's another layer to that analogy. If the day after I borrowed the money, I'd found the exact same amount of money I borrowed under the couch, then I probably shouldn't have borrowed the money because I would have saved myself that interest cost. So if I'd avoided the interest cost, that would have been a better alternative. Except now I'm stuck with this earlier commitment, which is inferior. So for de Beauvoir, marriage restricts us in the same way. We're locked into potentially inferior relationships where we could have found something better down the road. So by now it's clear, real love for de Beauvoir required generosity and equality. So for her, the idea of possessing the other person through their commitment fell on the wrong side of that struggle between generosity and greed. Her thoughts on committing to our partner through marriage was that it was a flawed approach. Her ideal approach emphasized generosity, and it was this. The ideal would be that each human being, perfectly self-sufficient, be attached to another by the free consent of their love alone. And this is a pretty non-committal idea for relationships. An instinctive argument a lot of people would make against this type of relationship is that a lot of choices by nature require some sort of commitment. True freedom probably doesn't lie in the avoidance of commitments altogether. As an example, while everyone looks at borrowing money differently, to not borrow money solely on the principle that it is a commitment, you could come to restrict your freedom down the road because of your avoidance of commitment altogether. It's just the world we live in. I mean, if you never borrowed money because it was a commitment, for most people, that would make it impossible to buy a house, at least with a mortgage. So going against de Beauvoir's ideas here, I think most of us would be more inclined to say that if we are to love freely, then the choice of a commitment itself can be an exercise of freedom, which is made slightly muddy by the fact that down the road, it will lead to other restrictions in freedom. That's the case for most important decisions we make. Where I agree with de Beauvoir here is that it is possible to enter a committed relationship without the paperwork that comes with marriage. But a point I'm wanting to note here is that commitment itself is not inherently bad. I think a more practical takeaway from de Beauvoir's work here is that a problem with marriage is that the partners we choose to make a commitment to are potentially stuck with us for life. And unless we commit with this in mind from the outset, the risk is that we're committing our future selves to a life where our projects and pursuit for meaning may not be expressed freely. In Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it's mentioned that they're jumping into the relationship too quick, before they really know each other, and not knowing each other is what leads to the downward spiral of their relationship in the movie, which would in most cases end a relationship. Thirdly, for de Beauvoir, marriage was in effect an anti-aphrodisiac. In Mr. and Mrs. Smith, they meet and have a one-night stand. That initial passion leads to their relationship. We see this all with flashbacks, but the film actually starts at a point where it's pretty evident the attraction has diminished. De Beauvoir warns us that rather than being held together by passion or genuine desire to be together, marriage very often relies on both partners sticking to a vow more than anything. And more than this, there's a daily erosion of sexual attraction you can have for each other, not just because you become overly familiar with your partner, but also because you start to take each other for granted. She even says, daily intimacy creates neither understanding nor sympathy. This erosion of attraction is pretty apparent in the movie as well.
There's this huge space between us, and it just keeps filling up with everything that we don't say to each other. What is that called?
Marriage.
Okay, so according to de Beauvoir, there was a few problems that come along for the ride in any marriage or committal relationship. So I'll just summarize the main points and takeaways from what she says that can lead to happiness. The main dynamic within a marriage or a long-term relationship, which needs active management, is the struggle between generosity and greed. Another way to look at it is the struggle between equality and generosity against commitment and control. So if you're able to avoid a controlling dynamic and actually support the pursuits and projects of your partner, then the commitment to a relationship could actually be beneficial in that sense. Here are the other things to keep an eye out for. Support your partner's projects and share responsibilities generously. There is a restrictive nature to the structure of marriage within society. If you can get rid of the expectation of male as breadwinner and wife as housekeeper, then you can avoid a structure that restricts both partners and the projects they're restrained in pursuing. Now, that's not to say an arrangement where the husband was a breadwinner and the wife was the housekeeper is inherently wrong, but it becomes wrong when those are not projects that are chosen in pure freedom. Also, commitments in life are unavoidable, but there is a restrictive nature to commitment. The takeaway from her arguments would be when picking a partner, pick on behalf of your future self, because at the end of the day, a lot of decisions of significance entail some form of commitment on the back end. It should really be a case-by-case assessment on the benefits of the relationship, which you can freely choose are worth the sacrifices and commitment on the back end. Unfortunately, there's no real actionable takeaway here in the philosophy that helps us with the idea that marriage ends up being an anti-aphrodisiac. I just see her arguments as a proceed with caution sign. And it's maybe a downside to most long-term relationships that both people should be aware of before proceeding. It goes back to that idea of commitment, where if you're okay with the idea of commitment, you should be really considering your future self, and this may just be something you should factor in. So if de Beauvoir's arguments don't succeed in completely turning you off marriage or committed relationships, the takeaways stay the same. Strive for generosity over greed in your relationships, and don't let your relationships be something that come to restrict either partner's broader life projects. As she says herself, this requires both partners to join the common fight and support each other's freedoms and pursuits outside the relationship.